Hello everyone, my name is Janet Couloute and thank you for joining me on the virtual tour of the Black African presence in the Wallace Collection, a celebration of Black History Month that I hope one day will become obsolete as Black histories become an irrefutable part of British histories. People of Black African descent have been an integral part of the Western world, ancient and modern. The ways in which this presence is represented by artists in the Wallace Collection are both varied and subtle, and always through the prism of colonial constructions of racial hierarchies, with the white body at its apex, held in place by a notion of whiteness, according to Ruth Frankenberg, theorized as an unmarked category against which all other races are defined. Conversely, most, if not all, of the historical representations of Black people are informed by blackness, by which I mean a systematized conception of being Black, formulated by Europeans with vested interests in notions of race. The late African-American novelist Toni Morrison used an alternative expression, Africanism, that she defined as the denotive and connotive blackness that Black people have come to signify, as well as the entire range of views, assumptions, readings, and misreadings that accompany Eurocentric learning about these people. In other words, the images that we will be looking at bear no resemblance to being Black, by which I mean people of African descent, whose European existence was part of the diasporas created by the Atlantic trade, colonialism, and imperialism. Consequently, the image that I will discuss today do not openly celebrate Black African victories and successes, or indeed even the everyday minutiae of Black lives. Instead, what these images and portraits reveal are ways in which European elites wish their imperialist powers to be chronicled, which in turn provides the viewer with insights into the lives of Black Africans. Before I invite you into the Wallace Collection, I'd like to encourage individuals to assume a reflective stance and to ask ourselves how we might use the insights garnered from today's discussion to provide ways of provoking and challenging colonial legacies in our everyday lives. Whilst all of the figures in the discussion remain nameless or have had names foisted upon them, this shouldn't prevent us from affording them a presence and a personhood, and to have our curiosity aroused, to wonder why they were and who they were, how they got to the places in which we encounter them today, and indeed to wonder at the sort of relationships they may have had with the artist. In so doing, I believe new meanings will be brought to the paintings and the histories they represent. I never lose sight of the fact that I am looking at pictures that were not painted for a Black gaze. In other words, not painted for people like myself. I'm also aware that every time I stand in front of these images, I have an overwhelming sense that I have altered any prior perceptions the viewer may have had about the image, which is quite a powerful thing to be able to do. Therefore, what I hope to bring to today's discussion is another set of narratives on legacies of Black American enslavement and displacement. Events that were so violent and brutal that it actually defined full Western artistic representation. Your first encounter with the visual Black presence at the Wallace Collection is in the form of two late 17th century Italian marble busts entitled Bust of a Man and Bust of a Woman, The sculptor unknown, it's a matter of speculation whether the busts were based on living models or an idealized image of the Black African man and woman. Each bust appears free of the usual social and symbolic markers of Atlantic enslavement, such as chains, shackles, exposed skin, and the supplicatory glaze. Instead, we're presented with what appears to be individualized expressions, free of spectacle and attempts to overemphasize the bust's assumed Black African features. Both of the busts are wrapped in swathes of cloth. And we could argue that the sculptor, whoever he or indeed she may have been, has chosen not to dress them. The bust of the woman exudes a quiet dignity and interiority bordering on the melancholic that is heavily contrasted with the openly expressive stance of the bust of the man, whose toothy grin runs contrary to early modern European ideals of propriety. For instance, the highly influential 16th century philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam, in his treatise on good manners for boys, condemned unrestrained displays of laughter as symptomatic of insanity, and the open-mouthed laughter exhibited in the bust of the man as a canine habit. I would argue that the bust of the man plays into the stereotype of the laughing Black, who's assumed to be stupid and childlike, and to not understand his lowly position in life. There's an important question that we, of course, need to ask about these busts, and that is why the busts and the sculpture has dispensed with white marble, a medium that was believed to stay true to the purity and form of the sculptural arts, that suggested an elevated morality imbued with Grecian traditions and underpinned long established European ideals of beauty synonymous with whiteness. I would suggest that the use of black marble is a means of drawing attention to the racial origins of the sitters, a subtle aestheticization, if you like, of enslaved people, and at the very least, highlighting matters of difference. There's a strong sense of the sculptor reveling in the contrasting tones of the black, pink and white jasper marble of the bust of the woman's carefully rendered hair, with the headdress and the arrangements of flowers that, depending on how you register the bust, divert the viewer from the sculpture's true intentions. During the course of the discussion, we will see how black skin has and was presented as being on show, particularly when compared and contrasted with white skin, or precious stones and metals such as pearls, gold and silver. A well-known early modern adage penned by the publisher and printer Nicholas Lynn observed how a black face with a white garment is like a fly drowned in a spoonful of milk. As an aside, an attention to the material aspects of black iconographies and European artistic canons can offer further insights into the histories behind the images. For instance, pearls, which features in a number of images discussed today. An important aspect in Spain's expansionist zeal, ably assisted by Columbus, enslaved black Africans risked their lives from the early modern period, free diving for pearls along the Pearl Coast of Venezuela and the Caribbean. created out of the pain and chance and prized from their natural habitat. Pearls symbolize both sex, death, procreation, light, and darkness. Pliny the Elder was said to have asked, do we get the most bodily pleasure from luxuries that cost human life? And I would argue all of what I've suggested is pictorialized in Pierre Minard's portrait of Louis Caral and an unknown enslaved child who wears a string of pearls indicative of their enslavement. In both bust of the man and bust of a woman, the sculptor has emphasized, let's go back to these images, the sculptor has emphasized their black skins with tunics carved with white marble. There's also a suggestion that the natural earthy properties of the marble reflect the assumed racial characteristics of the sitters. Lest we forget, we're dealing with aesthetic and material traditions that were invested and imbued in the racialization of Black bodies, the hierarchization of race, and the concomitant idealization of whiteness. Qing-Ming Yang, professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, observes how decorative surfaces can stand in for racialized bodies. And in turn, notions of skin can be used sculpturally to suggest ornamentation as well as epidermal protection. Like the favored shiny surface of Chinese lacquer, believed in the 18th century to exude value and exotic luxury, we notice that the busts are highly glossed. And by drawing attention to the surface of the marble, reduce the realities of the slave auction, where in the hope of procuring best prices, the skins of enslaved people were oiled and their bodies dressed in so-called fancy clothes. The commodification of bodies complete, the surface and veneer become the points of contact and value. Gevert Flinks, a young archer, painted circa 1640, was something and has the something of a gravity and the solemnity of the bust of a woman. Flink was a pupil of Rembrandt, whose identification with him was so marked that until the beginning of the 20th century, a young archer was attributed to Rembrandt. The work is known as a trolley, which is a visual character study of a head, popular in the Dutch Golden Age. Unlike a portrait, it captured a generic expression, gesture, or in this instance, exotic type. The art historian de Groot, in 1915, under the title Negro Archer, described the image as, turned to the left, about 20 years, protruding lips and short hair in small curls. He holds a bow at his breast and with his right hand. The quiver hangs over his shoulder by a rich gold chain, large pearls in his ears and a narrow gold chain around his neck. He has a loose brownish green coat over a fine pleated shirt, adorned below with a gold chain, having large pearls as pendants. Full light falls from the left and on the white shirt across the face. More recently, the art critic for The Guardian, Jonathan Jones, in an article on Rembrandt and his links with the Atlantic slave trade, discussing a young archer, believed, and I quote, that there is certainly little hint of anything untoward, certainly not slavery's violence. I'm inclined to disagree. Holland by 1630 had recently become involved in the Atlantic slave trade. competing with the Portuguese and the Spanish, the Dutch secured a number of trading posts, the most important being Elmina in Ghana. As is heavily alluded to by de Groot, the most obvious allusion to the young archer's servitude, past or present, is the use of jewelry. Jewelry as adornment by Black people in Africa become markers of bondage in Europe. Not least the gold collar. Indeed, one of the most stunning features of the image is the manner in which the young boy is held in a shaft of golden light. The tradition of painting ornately dressed Black men in hunting scenes was a well-established 17th century Dutch style. We see it again in another 1640 work by Flink. In male portrait, he chooses to paint the sitter in profile, thus amplifying the anonymous and detached nature of the study. The sitter wears a gold earring, an elaborate coat with gold braiding at the shoulder, a satin shirt which illuminates his face, and a brocade sash worn across his chest, and finally a leather strap with a gold buckle, possibly attached to a bow. Another example is Jan de Vietje's 1647 engraving of the huntsman. Full of drama and tension, we are drawn into the work as we try to ascertain the true nature of the huntsman's surroundings. The accompanying inscription in Dutch reads, "So the Moorish boy with bow and arrow is focused on the enemy or game." In Albert Coup's 1650, The Starting for the Chase, an elaborately dressed Black servant holds a horse's bridle as his master's mount to go hunting. He has a curved sword at his waist and the dog's on a leash, an illusion of his own servitude. Like Flink's male portrait, he's painted in profile and is in proximity to the black horse. One can only assume that Coupe deliberately is aligning the servant and the horse to the same genus, and this allusion to breaking in, while the lighter coloured dappled horse is aligned to the profiled white huntsman. Applying my own curiosity to the young archer, and let's remind myself of him again. There's a real sense that a lot of care and attention has been taken over the image. Rembrandtesque in its use of light and shade, used to highlight the gold and pearl jewelry, by now conventional signifiers of the archer's servile status and the riches of Africa, the most prized being in the form of human beings, like this individual see on screen. While it's more likely that the archer was enslaved, with little choice in donning the huntsman's outfit and striking a pose, I can believe that there was a relationship forged between sitter and painter, and that in another guise, the work would simply be referred to as a portrait of Abiola or the young diplomat Adicia in hunting costume. Jean-Mac Natier's 1733 image of Mademoiselle de Clément as a sultana is an example of French Orientalism, commonly known as Turquerie. Orientalism was a term coined by the cultural critic Edward Said in 1978. It denoted literary and visual Western constructions of the Middle, Far East and Africa as distant, ahistorical, irrational, exotic, and sexually uninhibited. We see an elevated and oddly static, pale white Mademoiselle de Clermont, granddaughter of Louis XIV, looking straight out of the canvas in the guise of a sultana, being prepared for a bath. I believe the relationship between Clermont's white body and the variety of skin tones displayed by the black servants are key to our understanding of the piece. An interplay of black and white female bodies where the presence of the black female servant is now a well-established trope for sexual transgression. For example, as a gauge for the level of depravity in which Tom Rakewell has sunk, William Hogarth has included a black woman in the debauched tavern scene in his well-known 1735 A Rake's Progress. In Natier's image, the black female servants are used to deflect white female displays of sensuality, as seen in Clermont's startling display of admittedly crossed, but nevertheless very bare white legs. Unusual for its time, Clermont is surrounded by no less than 5 adoring black servants of varying skin tones, acting as a foil to her white skin. The direct gaze of the bare-breasted, lighter-skinned servant brings a sexual frisson to the scene. And this is in contrast to the darker-skinned servant who has the more arduous task of filling Clermont's bath. We also notice that at least 2 servants are painted in profile. This draws attention to their physiognomy. Since the 17th century, profiles were used as pseudo-scientific markers of racial difference. Natier's painting presents as a visual taxonomy of racial hierarchy. The notion of the white race was first promoted by the 18th century German physician and anthropologist Blumenbach, who divided the world's population into 5 color groups and introduced the term Caucasian, applying it to those he considered white, a race from which all others were believed to have originated from, with racial differences the consequence of climate and diet. Proponents of polygenicism, the doctrine that human races are distinct and immutable. Knott's and Gliddon's well-known and widely disseminated types of mankind display 3 profiles and corresponding skulls, presented as irrefutable scientific fact by dispensing with detailed supplementary texts. A classical white marble bust of Apollo, echoing insights made at the beginning of this discussion, is compared with a heavily cross-hatched etching of a caricatured black man's profile with that of a chimpanzee. Given such pseudo-scientific accounts, Clermont's decision, and it would have been her decision, to confidently assert her rank and privilege in such a risque fashion would have been buoyed by the certainty of her racial superiority. Painted circa 1718, Anton Watteau's The Charmes de la Vie, or The Attractions of Life, is an image that at first glance has all the hallmarks of the Rococo style made famous by Watteau, known as fêtes de galop. These were flirtatious, intimate music parties set in elegant pastoral idylls, or in this instance, an elegant terrace. Music symbolized the hoped-for harmonies and cadences of romantic encounters, but also acknowledged the discord and missteps of courtship and lovemaking. Positioning such affairs of the heart on the borders of civilized life, such as gardens and terraces, and the untamed nature of world, suggests Watteau's interest in the aristocratic obsession with artifice and mastery over brute nature, whether through the fashion for highly manicured gardens or the acquisition of seemingly wild, dark-skinned young black pages, tamed by dressing them in fine livery and giving them classical names such as Marcus Aurelius, Spiro, Pompey, and Mungo. In Charms de la Vie, the restricted membership of the group is demarcated by the middle ground taken up by the thyribist, and a thuribo was a type of lute. The thyribist appears just a little too bouffant and fluffy, and he appears to be conveying his ineptitude in matters of the heart by his awkwardness in tuning his phallic-shaped thuribo, and who, like the assembled group, could at any moment stagger and fall into the depths of depravity. But more about that later. Like a great chain of being, which was the ancient mode of categorizing creation with God at its summit, which is further insinuated, I might suggest, by the carefully arranged shapes on the tiled terrace, given the illusion of a chessboard on which various ranking pieces are arranged. The apex of this hierarchy is taken up by the standing white male aristocrat, modelled on Watteau's friend, Nicholas Wiegels. His authority and power are further enhanced by the solid and impermeable columns of the terrace. The seated young white woman who plays her guitar unaccompanied is a testament to her singularity and rightful position in the chain, and is in contrast with the gauche thuribo player. Assuming a lower position to the young woman playing the guitar, the devotional attention of the young brown-skinned brown man, the young brown-skinned man towards the more elevated woman beside him, who seems reciprocated and responsive to such attentions. Ideals of etiquette and training is suggested by the well-behaved children and the pedigree lapdog. Then as now, children and dogs were seen as raw nature in need of chaining and training. There comes as no surprise that the base of the chain was occupied by the young black boy and a flea-bitten dog, compositionally presented in opposition to their visual counterparts in the form of the well-groomed children and restrained lapdog, who, unlike his foil, in the form of the mongrel, knows that there is a time and a place for scratching his behind. The boy's proximity to wine, based on the long-held belief about Black Africans' propensity to drunkenness, is a common motif in European art, and one that I hadn't naturally thought of until and during the course of putting today's discussion together. And what I found was that there were a number of images portraying Black men in apparent drunken states. I was struck by one image in particular, particularly because of its ordinariness, produced by an Portuguese artist. It consisted of a crowded outdoor scene where, in the midst of the everyday hustle and bustle, an inebriated Black man is being taken away by two officials. Its added poignancy for me was in how it reminded me of the likelihood of enslaved Black Africans using alcohol as a means of dulling the brutalities of enslavement. Like Watteau's Wine Steward, young Black boys serving wine can be seen in countless banquet scenes and works by elite artists such as Rubens and Veronese. For instance, Veronese's Marriage of Cana, and a later image by the same artist, The Feast in the House of Levi. Wine's inclusion in the Charms de la Vie, used as a symbol of self-gratification and disinhibition, also foregrounds the stereotype of the libidinous and sexually uninhibited Black African man. The art historian Judy Lunt astutely observes how, like the enslaved boy, wine might be said to be plucked, processed, and packaged by and for the cultivated. The Black Africans' assumed uncontrolled sexuality is implied by the bottled submergence in water. Let's find the image again. An allusion to passion quenched, which is further alluded to by the boy's handling of the phallic-shaped bottleneck while staring at the girl with the guitar. Of course, the young boy's inclusion in the image evidences a servile Black presence in 18th century France. Despite its proclamation that there was no slaves in France, laws such as Louis XIV's Edict of 1716 gave colonial slave owners the right to bring enslaved Black men and women to France, free of the concerns that enslaved individuals would succeed in petitioning for freedom. It's also important for us to remind ourselves of France's colonial possessions in the Caribbean, a case of out of sight, out of mind. Like a brutalizing book of etiquette, the Code Noir, or Black Code, was a set of laws passed by Louis XIV in 1685. Governing enslavement in the Caribbean, it covered everything from forced conversion to Catholicism through to marriage rights, parental responsibilities, punishment and manumission. Behaviour perceived as inappropriate for a Black man is reflected in another work by Watteau. Painted somewhere between 1714 and 1717, entitled Voulez-vous triompher de belle, or Do you want to conquer beautiful women, amidst a sombre fete galant and allusions to the Italian Comédie dell'arte, which was a form of pantomime theatre with parallels with minstrel shows. The main focus of this image is on the amorous behaviour of the black-faced harlequin and a startled Columbine. Behind harlequin is what might possibly be an allusion to a term of Hymen. A term was the base the statue was standing on, and Hymen was the god of marriage and fertility, traditionally holding a torch signifying ignited passion, a nuptial veil, and sporting a large phallus. We see a similar, if less obvious, gesture in Watteau's The Champs-Élysées, where a white woman appears unsure of the attention of a brown-skinned man. The encyclopedist Marmontel, believing the African slave was the original model for Harlequin, described the perfect Harlequin as having the suppleness, agility, and grace of a cat, a superficial coarseness, his role as a lackey, patient, faithful, greedy, always in love, distressing and consoling himself with the readiness of a child. Descriptions that play into the persistent stereotypes of the servile, oversexed, loyal, and childlike black man. Indeed, let's remind ourselves of this. There's something cat-like and predatory about the young black boy in Watteau's Champs-Élysées, dressed in close-fitting silken gown and outfit, as if he's about to pounce. Both Robert Hornback and Pierre-Louis Duchamp's study of minstrelsy and the Italian Comédie dell'arte convincingly describe early manifestations of Harlequin sporting a large phallus and blackface, particularly when celebrating Bacchus, another example of conjoining of wine and the lascivious black man. Indeed, Louis Jacobs' 1729 engraving of a now lost painting by Watteau, entitled The Departure of the Italian Players by Louis XIV in 1697, depicts Harlequin as a black man sporting a phallic-shaped object protruding from his belt. By the late 18th century, the conflation of black male licentiousness and Harlequin is now joined with Robinson Crusoe's Manfride and Shakespeare's Othello, as seen in this widely available 1718 English print entitled Gentle Desdemona and Harlequin Friday. Printed as a kind of warning against black male carnality, it depicts a black man's kissing and fondling the breasts of a white woman who seems to have fallen prey to his advances. Having seen a production of Othello, a theatre flyer publicising the play having fallen, as we can see, from her hands. Paraphrasing Iago's rabble-rousing cry to Desdemona's father, Brabantio, the accompanying caption reads, "Sir, you're robbed. You've lost half your soul. Even now, the black ram is topping your white ewe. Arise, arise. Awake the snoring citizens with the bells." In addition, as James Small's notes, the facial and bodily exaggeration of 19th century minstrels are seamlessly conjoined in a widely circulated illustration by the popular French newspaper, Le French Courrier, by the artist Jean-Francois Raffaelli, called Minstrel Pestering a Columbine Backstage. It has all the iconographic intent of Watteau's Voulez-vous triompher de belle? Do you want to conquer beautiful women? I want to finish with an object rather than a painting. Crafted in between 1830 and 1850, this equestrian trophy cup belonged to Lord Henry Seymour, half-brother to Sir Richard Wallace, one of the founders of the Wallace Collection. Craftsman unknown, the equestrian trophy cup is made of silver, gold, precious stones, and enamel. The top of the trophy consists of a triumphant St. George astride a white horse, driving his lance with some force through the mouth and out through the neck of the dragon. St. George's victory over the dragon follows the Western tradition of consolidating victory over one's domain through the display of the subjugated. Salient example of this is Pietro Tacca's 1626 Monument of the Four Moors in Livorno, Italy. The term Moor, a fluid term denoting Muslims and Black Africans. Cast in bronze, the four individualized slaves are chained at the base of a statue of the Grand Duke Ferdinand I in commemoration of his victories over the Ottomans. Like an ornately jeweled great chain of being, with the white knight at the apex, followed by two white steeds, the trophy maker uses the sheer opulence of the cop to divert the violent display of four Black enslaved figures, shackled and chained and bearing the weight of the prized object. Like the highly polished marble of the bust of the man and the bust of the woman that we saw earlier, the realities of Black African enslavement and the commodification of Black bodies are referenced by the black polished enamel of their caricaturous faces and their striped gowns, an authentic detail of the rough striped material used as a marker of enslavement and plantation slavery. More obvious visual markers such as collars and the ball and chain, the latter in the form of pearls, another allusion to enslavement, are seamlessly incorporated as a design feature. It's also important to note how the craftsman, in applying a caricatured style to the four enslaved figures, is able to exaggerate and parody their facial features, which is in stark contrast to the realism applied to the white figure of St. George and the horses, another consummate means of indicating racial difference and worth by the simple application of artistic styles. The trophy cup is one of many representations of Black servitude, where the harsh realities of enslavement are erased in favour of more palatable depictions, where Black servitude is made to look effortless and the Black body naturally constructed to bear weight. Take, for example, the work of the Italian furniture maker Andrea Brustolon, where a console table displays three, again, highly polished Black men, two of which carry a Japanese vase. Like the lowly positioning of the female slaves on the trophy cup, whose humanity is deemed of lesser worth than the horses, the Japanese porcelain, another important example of the exotic in 18th century, is elevated both literally and metaphorically above the Black figures. The equestrian trophy cup is a convenient place to conclude my discussion, bringing together a number of elements discussed earlier, such as the racially charged image of whiteness and subjugation in the figure of St. George, seen earlier in Tacca's Four Moors. The trophy's reference to minstrelsy, which by the mid-19th century had crossed the Atlantic to Europe, and by the 1840s was well established in France and in its links with blackface, comédie dell'arte and harlequin. Also, the obvious references to Orientalism and the exotic Black skin acting in opposition to the luminous whiteness of the horses, that in turn are underpinned with anthropological racial hierarchies suggested in a number of the images that we looked at earlier, which I think also has an allusion to the popularity at the time of human zoos, where Black people were presented as spectacular entertainments, combining the theatrical, the scientific. For example, Sarge Bartman, known as the Hottentot Venus, whose protruding buttocks was deemed an ethnographical curiosity that persisted well into the late 20th century. Thank you.